Hello there my friends, welcome to my another video. Today we are gonna be working on a diorama for the T-54 I finished last week, if you've seen that video. Now here, as you can see, the model is not painted yet, and that's because I was kind of working on the diorama alongside the T-54, just so I knew what direction I wanted to go in and to speed up the process. Here you can see a small styrofoam square that I cut out to create the base of the diorama, and then I started to think up the house for the diorama. I've originally started making the house for the diorama out of styrofoam. I created a simple shape and thought I'd simply use the softness of the material to create all the textures and whatnot. I also thought some thick paper would be good enough for a base of the roof that I could then work out from. Needless to say, this whole process was pretty much pointless. The house was very crooked, it didn't work out really well, and the paper didn't work well either. While the original shape did seem okay, I knew I had to change my approach a bit. So I went to a hardware store and I found this. This is a piece of a PVC plastic. Maybe you recognize it, it's the material that Nightshift used in his facade video. It's essentially a hardened foam that has sort of a hard exterior or a shell. And it's really similar to plastic sheet, but it's ever so slightly softer, so it's pretty easy to cut, not as easy to cut as styrofoam, but also this way it's easier to make it perfect. I use super glue to glue all the pieces together. Using this ease of gluing, I created the base shape of the house. I must admit I chose a really weird angle for a square house. It was quite annoying to create for the diorama, which made the process quite more annoying and hard than it needed to be, but at the end of the day I ended up with a nice base for the house. Had a square, that was the walls. I also created a base for the roof that I will then put all of the rest of the materials for the roof onto. Once the basic shape of the house was completed, it was time for some textures. I started by making the lower part of the house have some stone texture. This was done by simply engraving it using a tip of a mechanical pen, since it was the best not sharp but round metal thing I had. The ability to do this was definitely a very strong point of the material, because it was easy to crave the thing into the surface, but it didn't crack or damage it. Next came texture of the walls. There was simply thick Tamiya putty stippled on undiluted. I'm roughly recreating a typical Czechoslovak house that you can find anywhere in these parts. I just found references scrolling through Google Maps through my own city. My biggest dilemma was the roof. At the end I settled on using an old beer that I flattened out and cut into pieces for the main part of the roof, main texture, main shape. Trying to replicate a specific version of a roof that I see often used in these parts. I know this isn't really how the roof is constructed in real life. I think the plates should overlap and then be connected together, but I decided to replicate the look of the roof more than how the roof is actually constructed, because this is such a small scale. And also I didn't make the best measurements. This is really the worst part about what I did here. So I just cut the pre-made roof into small rectangles that I then started gluing onto the base of the roof. This is where the miscalculations kind of showed off. And the roof definitely isn't perfect due to them, but I do really like how it looks nonetheless. And I'm pretty proud of it, mainly comparing it to the old house that I made last year for my T-72M2, if you remember that. After gluing far too many squares onto the roof, I also used the cut up metal to make gutter as well. This could have been also better, it's not perfectly straight. There's definitely a better method for making gutters for little houses, and I'll probably definitely look it up in the future. I used some spare PE and some wires, some wood sticks as well, to create smaller little details on the surface of the house. For example, the PE was used to create little doors for electrical outlet. With that, it was time for painting the house. I start priming the house with a Vallejo Mecha Primer acrylic. Of course, first I forgot to mention I wanna paint the figures, because I wanna do the classic glazing method. So I primed them in black, and then I start spraying the house. I'm mainly focusing it on the roof itself, because metal doesn't like holding acrylic paints, but so that's why I prime the metallic parts first, so they're not pointlessly shiny. But I prime the entire house with this color. The Mecha Primer is diluted with ordinary acrylic thinner. There are no mixing ratios, I just eyed it until I was happy with how it looked. Red is used for base color of the roof. I sprayed it sorta in a cloudy manner, more towards the middle of panels, so it creates some shading, and it's a bit too bright on the video and even in real life, but I toned it down with some weathering later down the road. The rocky parts on the bottom are painted with layers of several diluted browns that are stippled on to create differing colors. The main part was painted with some grays, and I did record it, but later on I actually decided to repaint it because it was too dark. So here you can see me painting it with Vallejo Model Air White, which is a pre-diluted white for airbrushes, but I don't really find it suitable for my airbrush. But for this brush it was pretty good, because since it's a thin paint, it did show through the gray a little bit, so it made the house look a little weathered and darker, and not unnaturally white or just too bright. The gutter was painted with some silver color, and then I started weathering the house a little bit. I weathered the roof and also the front of the building by simply taking some browns, and in case of the roof some darker reds, and just making some streaking effects from the top of the panels towards the lower parts. This is basically just some undiluted dry paint that I unloaded, and then I just spread it onto the weathered parts. It was time to start painting the figures, Vojta and Jožo, using glazes, as I already mentioned. So after painting the black primer, what I did was I sprayed some white from the top, which created fake shadows and fake highlights on the figure, showed me where the highlights should be, and this can also be used for beginnings of highlights, because for painting I put translucent layers onto the figure to create basic shading. I first start by painting the skin tones. I don't use a particular skin color, I just mixed up one myself, and I just dilute it enough to be watery, but I unload it onto my finger or a napkin, so it's not actually like, it's not a blob of water, it's just a very translucent paint on my brush. And I started layering it onto the skin parts, and once that looked pretty good, I used this fake shadowed highlighted area that was created with the glazes. I used it to create more fake highlights using thin brush and continuously lighter and lighter colors. I simply just painted all the highlighted areas like tip of the nose, the eyebrows, cheeks. I put on these highlights until I was definitely satisfied with how the figures looked. Then I went over them with a Vallejo game wash. This was the amber one, which darkened them down and created shadows in the eyes and where they were needed. However, this looked a bit too dark, so I went over it again with some highlights, and that's the skin done. And I basically did the exact same thing over and over the entire body. Well, these soldiers did wear black uniforms, so that's what I used for them. These are probably my best figures, but I'm still not sure what the hell I'm doing. I'm pretty bad at explaining it. I hope you kind of understood what I mean when I say what I do with these figures. I'll definitely try to explain it more once I personally understand it more, but I was pretty happy with the result. It was time to continue further with the diorama. I used this piece of styrofoam, filled to the brim with Vallejo Model Air White. I just covered it in undiluted color, and I just left it to dry overnight, which created this nice crust, which helps me create some nice cinder, concrete blocks. This will be used for a fence, because I originally wanted to make this just a peaceful little diorama, but after some stories that I've heard and some ideas to make the diorama have a little story by itself, I decided that the poor driver Vojta didn't notice the fence that was in his way, and he knocked it down with his tank during exercises. So started creating the fence by cutting the styrofoam that I pre-prepared overnight into little squares and just gluing it onto the diorama into a sort of a fancy fancy shape. Now, this showed me why you shouldn't use super glue on styrofoam. It did react and burn in some little holes, but those weren't visible because they were underneath the concrete blocks, and the concrete blocks themselves glued together didn't do any reaction because there was the paint layer that protected them. I created the destroyed blocks that the tank knocked over with by simply tearing the pieces apart. In the end, I was pretty happy with this little story that I created after posting the finished diorama or some on some Facebook groups. I was told a few stories that pretty much explained why this is definitely 100% something that would have happened and might have happened, because these kinds of things happened a lot. Even Uncle Nightshift told me a story about an American N48 that got into trouble like this. So I was pretty happy with the little story I created. It was time to bring it into life. I wanted to create some groundwork on the diorama, so I put down a little piece of masking tape to differentiate between the ground and the road. And I started creating the ground by just putting on a very thin layer of VMS Smart Mud. it's kind of struggled to get glued onto the surface, or well, get stuck to it. However, since it was so thin, I could spread it with my finger until it stuck. I then started to cut in the individual blocks of the road. I originally wanted to make it paved, but I wanted to try making little blocks instead. This didn't work out quite well because if you've ever worked with styrofoam, you might know that if you cut it at the wrong angle, instead of cutting, it usually tears, and it's really hard to avoid this. And I personally don't know how to avoid this, but so if you do know how to avoid the foam tearing instead of getting cut, please let me know down in the comments. But here you can see that the small cuts that I did for each individual block was simply just a tear in the styrofoam because of how it acted, which was kind of unfortunate, and it made it quite crooked and just not precise. But this is my fantasy world, and it doesn't need to be perfect, because that's probably what makes it more perfect. I decided to put some texture onto the road. This was simply stippled some more Tamiya gray putty, and once that was done, I started painting the fence. Again, first was a thick layer of undiluted Vallejo Model Air white, then I mixed it with Model Air black, because these are the only Model Airs that I have for some reason, and I simply started making some good old wet blending. So before the white had any time to dry, I added just stipples of grays and blacks onto the concrete blocks, which created a nice multicolored concrete look that made them look pretty realistic in my opinion. I could have definitely focused each block individually, but even in such a big shape, it was pretty nice. I then did something similar on the groundwork, on the mud. I stippled it with some differing colors of browns. These were basically acrylic paints diluted into washes, and I just let the VMS Smart Mud soak it up and create different colors. And then I used some green to create some mossy color on the concrete blocks and underneath them to blend them with the ground, because they looked kind of out of place. And I didn't want the fence to look new or anything like that. I wanted to look pretty old. The same technique as on the concrete blocks or the fence. I don't know what the fence was actually meant to be made out of, but I used the same technique on the road, basically painting it with differing colors of blacks and grays, letting them wet blend together to create a nice little color variation. And then after that was done, I also went over this with a really thick layer of black acrylic wash. Once that was dry, last effects I was adding was some foliage. They didn't want to go out of my mind with this, so I simply used some self-adhesive tufts in different sizes, and I glued them onto the surface. And I also used some sea foam to create different bushes as well. I put the bushes all over the diorama. This foliage definitely gave some life to the scene, and I was pretty happy with how it turned out. So I put the tank into place, and the diorama was done. So the spinny bit. I'm really happy with how this diorama came together. If you compare it with my old diorama with the T-72 M2 Moderna, if you remember that, you can see the complete difference in the quality, and I'm really pleased with how it ended up. With that being said, there's one thing I really have to thank you all for. We reached 1,000 subscribers. That's like mind-boggling to me, because of course this is a really small number in the YouTube era, and of course there is something that I wanna achieve apart from this, like in higher numbers, but this is really just a milestone that shows me that yeah, people care and people do want to see my projects, and that's really everything that I could ask for. So thank you so much for watching, for subscribing. It's been almost 2 years since I started making videos, and that shows how slowly I gain any subscribers, but still, I really hope that you enjoyed this project. I'm really proud of it, and I'm really happy that you've been here with me. I hope there's gonna be another 1000, even more. So if you like this video, please give me a like, comment, perhaps subscribe and join one of the people that want to show me that they care about my projects, and perhaps that I helped you with something. That's definitely the thing I want to do the most. Help you guys think some, you know, just get better at building models or get some inspiration. That's all that I'm here for. So thank you again for watching. I'll see you next time, and with some more projects, hopefully. Goodbye.